I'm going to invite the four previous presenters back up to the stage, take a seat at the table to go back over what we've heard before, give you a chance to ask questions, and to help with that, Dave Ulrich has graciously agreed to moderate this session. I think all of you know Dave. If you don't, you should. Dave is the Executive Director of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. His responsibilities include working with U.S. and Canadian mayors. 70% of the mayors come from Canada. We in the U.S. have some work to do here. From across the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Basin to help advance protection and restoration of this resource. He is also co-chair of the International Joint Commission's Water Quality Board, so a successor to a successor to a successor of Lieutenant Governor Dowdeswell. So over to you, Dave. Thank you for moderating the question and answer on this on the two segments we've just heard from.
Thank you, Cam. And all of those mayors, U.S. and Canada, are Blue Jays fans. Just wanted to make sure. I have limited authority as a moderator. If I had more authority, I would declare a recess and reconvene out on the shores of Lake Ontario. If you haven't looked out there, it is an absolutely spectacular day. But that is beyond my scope of authority, so we'll stay in here. I am sure with the excellent presentations that we have heard, there will be quite a few questions, and I would encourage you to start moving toward mics. There is one over there. And we have another one right here, and if you can line up behind those, that would be good. Don't be shy. Looks like, no, he's working for the door. And we've got some, there we've got someone stepping up. That's what I like to see. And this is questions and answers, not speeches. So if we could have some nice, tight, concise questions that will really challenge our panelists. If you could identify yourself and affiliation, and private citizens, great too. We like those affiliations. And if it is directed to any particular panelist, then please do that as well. Our first question, please.
I'm Christine Dermy from the region of Durham. We are a member of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. So it appears, my question is for the last two presenters. It appears that in some cases, it seems like there's been a more recent acceleration of activity towards addressing the areas of concern. That's sort of my interpretation of what you said anyway. So my question is, why has it taken so long since it was 1987? Is it a matter of funding? Does it just take a long time to make these changes? And are there new AOCs that need to be identified since 1987? Because some of the things you've identified, like the Phragmites invasions, seem to be quite prevalent in many places now. So those are my questions.
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to? I'll go first.
Come on, don't fight over it. One of you got to take it.
So to answer your question about whether or not there was sort of work going on since 1987, the answer is yes. I think that many local areas of concern were working very hard to move forward. One, really, pinpointing what the actual problems were in the exact locations, as well as trying to figure out what kinds of actions had to take place. I do think that there has been, at least for us on the U.S. side, somewhat of an acceleration since 2010 because of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which basically put a lot of money into our ability to move some of those projects that many of the locals worked very hard to develop but lacked funding to implement. And so our initiative has helped them, I think, implement a lot of those actions.
John, you want to add to that?
I'll just add that it's from '89 forward, things moved in stages. It took a while to actually characterize the problem, determine exactly what the nature was. Then the next step was to come up with a plan. The step after that was to execute it. You have to keep in mind that the problems in many cases go back 150 years. Like, it's really been an interesting discovery that some of the contaminants that we're now cleaning up at Randall Reef and Hamilton Harbor at a cost of $140 million go back to the 1840s. So, it took a long time to get into this state. It's taking a long time to clean it up. But there's been, I would say there's been an acceleration in some respects. In the Canadian IOCs, it's just been the last few years that all of the municipal wastewater plants in those AOCs have been upgraded to secondary treatment or beyond. So that in itself has made a difference. So it's also a product of understanding, and there's been a lot of knowledge gained in habitat restoration efforts. It's now a demonstrable skill for a backhoe operator to be able to place tree roots and create wetlands. It was not a skill that existed maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, I'm particularly good on that, John. This had never been done before, and a little figuring out had to be done. Yes, Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Gaucher with Freshwater Future. Thanks for your presentations and a good summary of a lot of the work that's been done so far. My question's directed to Nancy and Jacqueline with respect to tracking progress on toxic chemicals. I'm wondering whether or not it's a full picture if we're just using 2 chemicals to analyze and to track, and whether or not if we were looking at other emerging chemicals in the environment, whether we'd see a different picture in terms of the status and potential trends.
So I think for the purposes of the presentation, just because we were so limited on time today, we focused just on PCBs and PBDEs. But if you were to look at the complete toxic chemical suite of indicators, there are a bunch of other chemicals listed in there, both legacy and chemicals of mutual concern. And we've noted that moving forward with the new binational strategy for the contaminants of emerging concern group, we plan to work very closely with that group moving forward so that our indicators will help them to develop those binational strategies for toxic reductions.
Very good. We have a question over there.
Okay, I'll shift. So I'm Rhiannon Moore from the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation. My question kind of snowballs off of Nancy's. So when assessing the stressors and indicators, specifically toxics, in the Great Lakes, will the issue of microplastics in the Great Lakes be looked at in future assessments?
We don't have anything about microplastics at this time in the suite of indicators. The suite itself is always evolving. So if there are conditions or stressors that need to be addressed in the future, we will consider that and determine whether or not we would add a new sub-indicator to the suite. But at this time, no, we don't have anything for microplastics.
Question over here.
Yes, good morning. Thank you to everyone. My name is Gerald Parker. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Canadian Justice, and I have a 2-part question. Has the groundwater depletion by modern-day pirates been approached to mitigate and resolve? Can the groundwater indicators include and mitigate such piracy and environmental degradation? For example, here in Ontario, we are presently going through an outcry about Fergus Ontario and Nestle. We pay $3 for a bottle of water. Nestle's paying $3.71 for 1 million liters. How can we approach that, resolve it, because it's all part of the same water system?
It sounds like
Thank
an
you.
easy one. Who wants to tackle that one?
It's clearly not an AOC question.
I can't address most of that question, but what I can say is that the sub-indicator that we have in the suite looks at groundwater quality. So we're not really focused on groundwater quantity at this time, and not trying to pass the buck, but we will hear more about the groundwater issue later. I think it's today. So there may be some of that addressed at that time.
Boy, I didn't expect such a shy audience. Come on, folks. Here comes someone. Oh, two of them. One at a time, please.
Hi, sorry, Tim Alamachuk from TVO. My question's for John G. The progress report says that cleanup actions are complete in the Nipigon Bay AOC, but the Red Rock secondary plant hasn't been built. Construction hasn't even started. It's not starting until next year. What's your response to that?
The remedial action, we're working to complete actions in the remedial action plan and meet the delisting criteria. So Nipigon Bay, the criteria in terms of environmental quality have been met. Fish populations have met their targets, benthic impairments, and so on. The two municipal treatment plants there, one in Nipigon and the other one in Red Rock, were always seen as being a minor contributor to the problem. The major part of the problem was the Kraft pulp mill, how the Nipigon River was managed, the flows, and so on. The remedial action plan called for the governments to assist Red Rock and to assist Nipigon in applications for funding for those plants. That funding has been committed, so the funding is there for them to go ahead. Thereby, the action is complete. We expect the plant to go online, and but the completion of action was the commitment or the requirement in the remedial action plan to assist in the application. So as I said, federal and provincial funding is committed. Contracts are being let. We expect to see the plant go in. The plant is required more from the perspective of going to secondary treatment. Nobody sees primary treatment as being a successful or an acceptable type of treatment system anymore.
Back over to the other side. Let's hope we have a live mic.
Thank you very much. I'm Lee Ford Jones, a pediatrician at the Hospital for Sick Children in Social Pediatrics and Infectious Diseases. I just wondered, particularly on the Canadian side, of course, if you feel the connections of this wonderful work to the health sector is as good as you'd like it. Thinking in particular, for example, when I see an article in Lancet Neurology, just a wonderful review of the many newly recognized chemicals which impact child health and development and well-being, I sort of feel left hanging as to where that gets processed in our, Canadian or Ontario area.
Go ahead, Nancy. Go for it.
The focus of our work is looking at the state of the water quality. So I certainly agree that the environment has an impact on our health, and we have kind of touched upon it with the three last indicators that we presented about whether or not we can drink the water, eat the fish, or swim at the beach. So, our expertise and the work with all the scientists that we do for our State of the Great Lakes reporting is focused on environmental and not so much on human health.
Back over here, sir.
Chris McLaughlin, Bay Area Restoration Council. We represent the public interest in the restoration of Hamilton Harbor. The most concerning thing I heard this morning was that in the next 15 years, Ontario is going to add the equivalent of 3 cities of Ottawa to the Golden Horseshoe. I suspect that in Hamilton, we haven't seen the needle move on phosphorus because many of the gains that have been made through the remedial action plan have been offset by increasing intensification on the land, population increase, new impervious surfaces, and so forth. Recognizing that this trend is probably also existent in some of the Great Lakes states, and that the province of Ontario regulates land use planning, and so this may not be a principal concern of yours, but I am curious to know, to the degree to which I suppose the offsetting gains by a pipeline of development that represents the past and not the future in land management and built form, how much that concerns you in terms of achieving our water quality gains.
That, as you know, Chris, is a big concern, and that is why I think we're seeing increasing attention paid to low-impact development, to managing stormwater, to combined sewer overflows, and that's where we see the biggest investments being made over the next decade, really.
Another question over on the south side of the room.
Hello, my name's Meredith Denning. I'm a graduate student over at Georgetown University doing a PhD on Great Lakes management. I have a question also about groundwater. I understand for the first time this summer, the Great Lakes Basin allowed a municipality outside of our watershed to use groundwater from the Great Lakes watershed and return it. And I'm curious about whether the same groundwater quality standards are being applied and how. And also curious about whether this is expected to continue or change.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with what, with your question or what you're referring to, but
There's a town in Wisconsin that
It's a Waukesha diversion is what they're talking about.
okay, yeah.
That's the water compact.
Yeah, I think that goes with the Great Lakes Compact. I'm not sure if maybe the people from the groundwater session this afternoon would have information on it, but unfortunately, well, I think in terms of what the indicators cover, we don't have information on that.
Thanks to Mr. Goffin, we have just created what was called a parking lot, but we'll call it a bike rack in the true spirit. And our organization is a little bit involved in this issue, and I'll be happy to contribute to the event. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Amarin Mello, and I'm an environmental justice specialist for the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa. And I heard you speaking earlier about fish consumption rates and how fish in the Great Lakes are currently safe as long as you follow the guidelines for recommended eating. I'm wondering if you are considering treaty right to natural resources for the tribes and how tribal communities have higher fish consumption rates and that the guidelines are restricting those treaty rights. I'm wondering if you are aware of that and how you are addressing that.
Well, certainly, I believe, I'm not an expert on the guidelines, how they've been set, but the state and province, the states, the Great Lakes states and the province of Ontario, they set the guidelines. They have a general population for fish consumption as well as a sensitive population. I'm not positive, but I think the sensitive population includes tribal subsistence eaters, but I could check into that further if you'd like that information.
Yes, please.
Next question.
Yes, I'm Chuck Lawson with the International Joint Commission, and for Wendy and John, you mentioned the 5 binational AOCs, and John mentioned some work being done on the Canadian side of one binational AOC, and Wendy mentioned some work being done on the U.S. side of a different AOC, and I'm just wondering, can you really delist an AOC, a binational AOC until both countries do what they need to do? And it's not clear if there's much coordination going on in these binational AOCs.
Well, I'll start. There is some coordination between the different AOCs. Whether you can delist one side or the other is a good question. And I expect we'll be consulting on that as we move forward. I think we'll see some U.S. ones come up for that consideration soon and some Canadian. So it's a question that really remains to be answered.
So the one thing I would add to that is that for the binational AOCs, there is actually a lot of coordination that goes on. There is an agreement between the U.S. and Canada that governs a large number of them in terms of how we will interact. And most of the local advisory committees are binational in nature, meaning they have members from both the U.S. and the Canadian side on them. So they are looking at the AOC as a whole. There is some distinction, though, not all of the beneficial use impairments are identical on one side, on the U.S. side, or not necessarily identical on the Canadian side. And so each side does have, at times, distinct problems that they need to address in order for the use within the AOC as a whole to be restored. So sometimes when we talk about work we may be doing on our side or they may be doing on their side, it's because we've identified a very specific problem that relates to something on the U.S. side that needs to be addressed, or the Canadian side.
I know the panelists and I would have been disappointed if there had not been a question from the Great Lakes citizen, John Jackson. John?
Dave, thank you. On the areas of concern, and you had a question a few minutes ago about more development happening in the communities and so on, and the effect that'll have. And it's a real concern that the citizens who have spent decades, as have the governments, working to get the AOCs cleaned up, if we get delisted, or when we get delisted, will the resources be there to make sure that there is ongoing monitoring so that we don't get problems created that have already gotten so far down the road in terms of creating real problems that we go into a huge remediation process again? How can we be sure in those communities that the governments are still going to be putting the attention into the ones that have been delisted, in terms of making sure that new problems aren't arising or that old problems aren't coming back? That's the reassurance we need.
I'll answer that one. Remedial action plan completion reports, as I think they're going to be called in the future, invariably contain commitments of various sorts to monitoring or actions going forward. To give teeth to those commitments, the third goal, at least in Canada, the third goal of the Canada-Ontario Agreement in the Areas of Concern Annex actually lays out the requirement for that monitoring to be followed up and reported on as it goes forward in the future. So it's really a goal that is intended to ensure that those commitments to monitor or to do whatever at the point of delisting are carried out and followed up into the future. So that's how we hope it will work, and those things won't be forgotten, and all that good work won't slide backwards.
Our challenge is, of course, we know how hard it's been to get the resources already, and our fear is that governments sigh with relief, and therefore the resources are going to have to go elsewhere to other issues. And how do we make sure that those resources really be there, because commitments aren't necessarily followed out?
I don't know what to say. Like we put the commitments into the documents, and we expect that the governments will follow through in the future. It could take audits or evaluations by the the Canadian Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development to point out that those aren't being followed up. It could be individual citizens or whatever, if that happens. Hopefully it doesn't. There is a preference to committing to established, funded, long-term monitoring programs as opposed to unique one-offs that would be more susceptible perhaps to some kind of diversion in the future. But if the commitment's made, it's usually pretty thoroughly vetted that it expects to be followed up in the future. The one thing is that things are forgotten, and when we wrote in Goal 3 into the Canada-Ontario Agreement, the intention was that we would work against those forgetful, those times of forgetfulness, so that things are followed up as they must be.
Have another question down there?
Hi, yes. My name is Pam Tabawanang. I'm from Wissahickon First Nation. I'm part of the Robertson-Huron Treaty from 1850. And my question is regarding hunting and fishing. And I'd first like to applaud the efforts of the Great Lakes Water Agreement initiatives. In terms of areas of concern, I, as an Indigenous person, have a very grave area of concern, with that being 133 First Nation communities in Ontario. 85 communities have either a boil water advisory, a do not consume, or a do not use. This represents 64% of our First Nations communities in Ontario. And this is from the First Nations Inuit Health Branch website today. Grassy Narrows, which is mercury contaminated with lead and very serious health impacts for our Indigenous peoples up there. My question is, how can the ICJ influence preventative measures to have the government move and clean up on some of these contaminated lands where the contaminants go right into the water, which has serious health impacts on our people? And I believe that is a very pressing issue for our First Nations people, because it's not only one community, it's over 63% of our First Nation communities. So the question is, how can the ICJ influence our government to take action?
These folks, I guess, are not authorized to represent the International Joint Commission, and I'm not going to put them on the spot here, but we have a number of representatives from the International Joint Commission here who I think would be happy to speak with you. A lot of questions about jurisdiction over groundwater versus the surface water of the Great Lakes and things like that, but I am sure there is a great deal of concern about that. Providing fresh, safe, abundant drinking water to all peoples is critically important, and that would be a very serious concern.
Miigwech.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good morning or afternoon. Gail Kranzberg, Great Lakes citizen, also McMaster University. I want to come back to the RAP program, if I could, on something that was invented, over 10, maybe 15 years ago, which was the notion that when you finished implementation, but the beneficial uses have not yet come back, that you are an area of concern and recovery. And a few people in the room here who helped to invent that. But I'm curious how that has evolved, and I think that I'm going to ask a question of John, actually, because I know that we have a few identified on the Canadian side, which is a celebration that you've done everything that you can do, and now you're waiting for the ecosystem to recover. The question I really have, much like the question John had about binational AOCs, is policy kind of decisions, right? Like, can you delist one side or not the other? At what point is your thinking right now? At one point, for how long can you be an area in recovery? Okay, so at what point do you say no? You know, that's going to be 20 years. That's not an appropriate designation, or this could be 5 years in an appropriate designation. So I'm curious as to as to the government's thinking about this presently.
Wendy and I have been struggling with that very question, and I think most AOC practitioners have that same question as when the area of concern in recovery designation was formalized in the 2012 Water Quality Agreement. It's how long? It's an institutional thing. It's a policy instrument. You know, it's hard to see policy instruments like that being forever. That took us to the development of some guidance for AOC practitioners in terms of the things that they should consider when contemplating that as a designation, either as from the point of view of a remedial action plan team and an individual AOC, or government folks looking at a proposal as to, looking at it on its merits, right? And one of them is the consideration of time, and that it's probably valuable to give some consideration of time for purposes, as mundane as making sure that you have the resources and the monitoring available for that period of time, as well to enable people like myself to answer the question, like, for how long is this? And it's never a comfortable answer to say I don't know. The other point is that if you're contemplating that and you see the period of time is like really long, maybe that will motivate communities, governments, public, whoever it is, to perhaps consider other options to address the problem, to bring it forward. Because sometimes you say, well, we've done everything that's reasonable. Well, it seems reasonable if it's, you delist in 5 years. Maybe people would have a different perspective if you're saying, well, done everything, but it's going to be a century. Sort of century is sort of outside of anybody's thinking. So it's a consideration, I think, that's important, and I think we've learned that as we've moved forward with the two Canadian AOCs that are areas of concern and recovery, both Spanish Harbor up on the North Channel and Jackfish, is that the concept of time is important, if only from the point of view of the program and how long we should be monitoring and what we might expect as a trend. Is it going to be incremental or is it going to be significant year by year?
A little Great Lakes history for those of you who are not aware. Dr. Kranzberg was primarily responsible for the first delisting in Collingwood Harbor, a mere 7 years after designation and well before many others. So let's give her a little round of applause. I think we have time for one last question before lunch, and trying to keep on time here, please.
Okay, I'm Allison Turner. I'm a master's student at the University of Waterloo, so I actually get to study the Detroit River area of concern. I've been having a ton of fun with it. So my question is, of course, for the areas of concern folks. So you talked a lot about kind of the government and these experts doing these different projects or management actions, as they're called. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the role of the public, either in public advisory councils or more generally, and also the role of the public when an area of concern is currently occurring, but then also when it's delisted. So how are you going to support public action after it's delisted? What happens to those public advisory councils?
So from the U.S. side in the Detroit River AOC, from our perspective, the public plays a very key role, basically, and the Public Advisory Council plays a very key role. They're the first. They're sort of the boots on the ground people who really kind of have a sense of what parts of the AOC are sort of failing, which parts of the AOC actually need restoration. We ask our the folks who work in our public advisory councils to work very closely with our state agencies for purposes of defining a very specific list of projects. It's after they have that list that then we may meet with the states and the locals basically to talk about essentially which of those projects are implementable, which aren't. Sometimes, we get lists of projects and not everything's implementable. But we work with them then to refine those lists into, a list of projects that we all collectively can agree will actually restore the beneficial uses. Then once we do that, we implement them, we move forward. Many times, if you noted, it's like we've delisted 4 areas of concern, but we have a lot more where we finished all the work. And what that means is in many AOCs, there's a time lapse between when you complete that work and when you can actually delist it. And so what we have been doing is supporting the monitoring that needs to happen after all the work's done in those areas of concern, so that the delisting, we can know when we're going to achieve the criteria for delisting. On the U.S. side, what we're doing is we are supporting the local advisory committees for a year after the delisting occurs for purposes of figuring out how to transition their community advisory group into the larger lake-wide action and management plan that exists for the lake.
I'll just speak to the Canadian side of the river. I'm the federal co-chair of the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup Steering and Implementation Committee, which is a mouthful, but there is a public advisory committee component of the DRCC. The community has been involved in the DRCC in various ways, in various forms, through volunteer efforts, river cleanups, you name it, from the inception of the DRCC. It's one of the more active RAP teams, at least on the Canadian side of the river. They just had a cleanup weekend before last, where they announced the 2 BUIs that were redesignated earlier this year. So that was a bit of a celebration. We also ensure that the community has an opportunity to review any of the, we'll call them decision documents as we move forward. So if we move forward with a BUI assessment, we ensure that the community has had an opportunity to review it, to comment on it, and to have their comments addressed. And then as we move forward into delisting, so we're looking at a remedial action plan completion report, which is the ultimate goal for everybody, that the community is involved in that. And one of the hallmarks of the AOC program is is community involvement. The community's been involved in the identification of the problem, which was the old RAP Stage 1, in the plan, which is RAP Stage 2, and fundamentally involved in the definition of the criteria. So the delisting criteria usually have the community's fingerprints on it, as well as the scientists and the administrators and all the rest of it. And, you know, there's a range of way it's done, at least in the Canadian AOCs. Hamilton Harbor is one of the bigger AOCs, but they have a big history of basically public fora as they go through and they review the status of their delisting criteria and update them. So it's and I expect it's going to continue. I can't see anywhere. And that's, you know, to an earlier question about why it's been so long, at least on the Canadian ones, the criteria have been developed with public input, so they represent an outcome that is desirable to the community, which sometimes makes finishing the job challenging because you've got a high standard to meet.
Thank you, John. And before I turn it back over to Mike Goffin, let's give our panelists and our questioners a big round of applause.